All right, guys, welcome back. This is episode number 15, and today I'm sitting down with Dr. John Wagle with the Kansas City Royals organization, strength and conditioning coach, and I will let him go ahead and give a brief introduction. So, John, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. This is it's a really cool opportunity, and I owe a thank you to Chris Tabor for connecting us. A little bit about myself. I'm from Rock Island, Illinois, a little small town in the Quad Cities, about 2.5 hours west of Chicago. I stayed in my hometown for undergraduate, played baseball at Augustana College, and from there did have the opportunity to play a couple years of independent baseball. Also coached baseball during the off season. Actually started off in coaching as a hitting coach, so that was a little bit different role than maybe I'm in now. But once I retired from baseball, what I really missed was the off season. What I really missed was kind of that eternal optimism of preparation, and that kind of led me to strength conditioning. I kind of took my physics background from Augustana and then went the exercise science route from there, and kind of dove head first. Did a couple of internships at DePaul University and Western Illinois University, and was really lucky that after those two opportunities was able to be added on as an assistant at DePaul University under the then director Mac Calloway. Mac, I owe a great deal to. He's one of the best people I've ever met, and truly grateful for everything he did for me. Mac was there with us for a year, and then he took an opportunity that was better for his family. And at that point, I actually was able to move into the director position at DePaul, oversaw men's basketball, women's softball, the rest of the department there. Had a really good staff. Did that for a few years and decided that I really wanted to kind of better myself and try to increase my expertise, and went and started my PhD at East Tennessee State University, which was kind of nerve-wracking to quit a job and dive into that, but and a job I loved around people that I really got along with and worked well with. But ETSU has some of the legends of physical preparation that are still faculty there. Brad DeWeese, Mike Stone, Mike Ramsey, Meg Stone, Kimmy Sato was there at the time. Like it's a really long list of incredible people. So when you're looking to better yourself in that way, kind of all roads lead to Johnson City. So I spent a couple of years there, completed my PhD work. My dissertation was in accentuated eccentric loading. After there, from another stroke of luck, got connected with the sports science coordinator at the time of the Kansas City Royals, Austin Driggers, and he was able to bring me on as the strength conditioning coordinator, and I'm just finishing up my first year in that role. So I've been with the Royals now for a little over a year, and we're in a really exciting place, and now we'll see what the future holds for us.
Gotcha. All right, yeah, it's definitely, you're not kidding when you say some legends of the industry, man. Because I've read some of the publications from Dr. Stone, both Meg and Mike, and it's holy crap, I got to read that.
I was one that I feel like I got the education of a lifetime there. Honestly, it was on one end I got to have Dr. Stone as my dissertation chair. One of the greatest sports scientists ever. The godfather of American sports science I had the opportunity to have him as my chair of my dissertation, and then kind of on the other end with the coaching and the application, and on the speed development side, I shared an office with who I regard as probably the best coach in the United States right now, and Brad DeWeese. And so, those two things happening simultaneously under one roof really allows you to get a lot out of your development. And I'm truly grateful for it, and still reaping the benefits of it.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. So what led you to? I've talked with a lot of guys recently that are doing AEL research. So what kind of led to that specific research topic for you?
It was actually originally Dr. Stone's interest.
Okay.
It was a project that he had wanted to dive into to a greater extent. There was a dissertation on AEL before mine
Mm-hmm.
uh, by Chris McDonald, and Chris kind of gave a really good jumping off point. Did a lot in the EMG space
Mm-hmm.
with AEL, but Dr. Stone had some other research questions that he wanted answered,
Mm-hmm.
and I took a great deal of interest in it. Just more through conversation early on. It didn't start off as necessarily my dissertation topic,
Mm-hmm.
but in talking with Dr. Stone, and then I bought a pair of weight releasers, and kind of the rest is history. And was really fortunate that Dr. Stone sparked my interest in that area, because it ended up being a really rewarding project. And one that did, like as you mentioned, like a lot of people are diving into this area of
Mm-hmm.
research now, and so it's pretty humbling that like maybe my work and my team's work had a small part in kind of generating some of that momentum.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I think Dr. Tabor was the first one I talked with that had a research interest in that, and then Matt Hermes I talked to a few weeks back, and he did as well.
Yep.
So it's interesting to hear how you guys are implementing your experiments with those weight releasers. Like, are you using it with absolute beginners? Are you using it with very advanced people on the first rep, on all reps? What are you
Yep.
seeing in terms of where do you put that in the development phase? Um, anyway, I think it's really
Dr.
cool.
Tabor and I have a connection with these projects too. He and I continue to collaborate on ongoing AEL research, but Dr. Tabor and I kind of spearheaded a review paper on AEL. That was a little bit of the jumping off point for me to dive into it for my dissertation work too. And Dr. Tabor was also on my committee for my dissertation. So like there's a lot of overlap with he and I there with AEL. So it's really cool that we're able to continue this work too.
Now, this is something I'm guessing that you save for athletes that have been training for 5 years plus.
Tough to put an exact training age on it. I mean, it's definitely a tactic that you've got to have some training experience to undertake, for sure. AEL is a little bit more versatile in programming than it gets credit for, I think. It's not necessarily that novice athletes can take this on, but a really like big underpinning factor for me is technique. And can you maintain that technique under the overload? And so, like, if you're fundamentally changing the way an exercise is executed or has to be executed due to the programming decision, then like you do have to kind of make sure that you're doing the right thing, and that's kind of regardless of training age or strength level or anything like that. And so if they are younger, more novice athletes, it's not that AEL is not a useful tool in any way for them, but they're probably not going to have as much kind of robustness in their technique to be able to handle the programming decision.
Now, how's that work with skill specific, like sport specific athletes? Because I see, track athletes using all these gadgets. I see baseball, softball using all these gadgets that alter their mechanics of a movement. So, is it good that something alters their mechanics? If they're using a resistance band to try to accentuate leg drive, but that changes their gait, is that good, bad? I mean, what are your thoughts on that stuff?
It can be. It's more so that you need to know what specific things are changing around the constraint that's manipulated. That approach to motor learning is not without value. It's certainly one of the more like evidence-driven approaches to skill acquisition. It's just a really easy thing to misapply.
Right.
And I think a lot of that comes in that like we manipulate this environment or the task or the individual, and we're not quite sure how that is happening or to what extent or what specific characteristics about the skill itself, the running stride or is being changed. And so that's where it kind of becomes a little bit muddy. And so just like even if we kind of dilute it back to the weight room, like any training decision that's made, just got to understand what's happening as a result of that, and that's both acute and chronic effects, and that's where that same principle should be applied to anything that looks more like the sport.
Right. Yeah, I see a lot of these people are, I don't know if it's so much these companies that are just trying to make money and market the crap out of this stuff and say, here, buy our stuff. And,
Sure.
people take in this data, but then they don't understand how to apply the data that they now have.
Right.
I'll see some of that. But a term that I'm sure you're familiar with that has been receiving a ton of popularity recently is that load management, specifically with the NBA.
Yep.
So thoughts on that? I mean, is that basic periodization that we've been doing for a long time in the weight room that's just now got a different term?
Mostly.
Okay.
Yeah, mostly. I would say. I mean, it's hard, and this is more like my opinion. This is very scientific, but it's extremely logical to want to protect an asset that you're paying tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And so, from that standpoint, like if the sports scientists, the physical preparation folks, as part of those organizations, they have 1,000 times more information than anybody on the outside looking in.
Mm-hmm.
They are making a decision around a certain player needing to take some time off for load management reasons. Then I would say it's perfectly reasonable. You wouldn't necessarily go out and buy a Ferrari and then immediately partake in a back and forth across the country road trip. Like that's not what you do with a Ferrari. So it's kind of one of those things that I think is unpopular because it's different at the moment, and but is rooted in quite a bit, as you mentioned, with basic training theory and physiology. And so, from that standpoint, it's difficult for me to construct an argument against it. I mean, I certainly, like, as a fan of, like, I'm a huge NBA fan. As a fan, it's certainly something that if I went to a game, I'd be bummed if I couldn't see a certain player that was sitting due to load management. But at the same time, like, the athlete side of it, like, they get one opportunity to have a career. Like, that's it. You don't get two NBA careers. You don't get two NFL careers. You get one. And so from that standpoint, like, I can appreciate what the service providers are trying to do to help them not only like win this year, but also lengthen their careers and play for a really long time.
Right. Yeah, that's one thing I've been talking with our athletes about recently. And granted, for these kids that are, we work with a lot of junior high school kids. They're not going to require load management necessarily yet, but it is important for them to understand the basic premise of everything that's happening and why it's happening. And, I'll talk with kids about not every competition is equally important. And that's something that's really hard for them to understand. What do you mean? This is a very important competition. It's like, well, you're playing fall baseball and nobody's going to be there nor care. When's your state title? Let's look at that. And anyway, we just try to teach our athletes about these basic concepts now, so that when they do advance, they're familiar with it.
It's really challenging. I mean, having been an athlete for quite some time myself, like, I can't say that I would have been able to flip that switch off either and say that, this isn't an important competition, or I'm going to sit here because of fatigue or something like that. Like, I was a really competitive guy. And that's probably why I continue to seek opportunities in sports. But, it is a really challenging thing that athletes, they do have to put a lot of trust in people that they have their best interests in mind. And that's definitely not easy for really competitive people. And those are the types of people that you want. And so it's definitely a unique challenge in modern sport.
And I know we can speculate all day long, but I think it's one of those things where I would be interested to see how it relates to the injury rates of the guys who are pushed the most. For example, like, Andrew Luck is one that's popular. Kobe's Kobe's career was interesting to look at. Kevin Durant's Achilles. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
would these guys have had all of those injuries if they were managed properly? I know it's hard to say, but something I kind of think about as you kind of see these bigger stars get injured more frequently. I would be interested to
Yeah.
see what the research.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question, and one that especially when they are star players, those ends of one definitely generate a lot of conversation, and they generate a lot of speculation, and those star players, like, their demands are probably higher than a lot of the other athletes. The as you mentioned, the Kevin Durant, the Andrew Lucks, like, the ball and the game decisions are in their hands more often than other players, and so certainly a consideration. Like, the unfortunate part is that injuries are extremely multifactorial, like, to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
nth degree, and so it's really challenging to tease apart, and it's also, like, really easy to create a narrative that
Mm-hmm.
fits in our
Yeah,
our
that's true.
mind well, and so, like, I think from the physical prep, S&C, like, performance science side, we do turn to load management because we do know a great deal about that space of fatigue science.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact of the matter is, we're dealing with
Yeah,
a whole infinite list of things that could have contributed to that, and so that's where it does become a little bit dangerous if we get the narrative machine going too much. It kind of blinds our critical thinking ability. Because really, what the most important thing is that moving forward with any of those athletes, that they do have an approach in place that's going to prevent anything like that from happening. So they do need to deconstruct it a bit, but the thing that they need to do more than anything is to work towards making that athlete more resilient to something like that occurring again.
right. So, what are you doing with your guys right now? Are you doing GPS tracking, total time that they're in a certain intensity zone?
No, I mean, there's we don't currently have any on-field like GPS or accelerometry that we're using. Baseball season is really long,
Mm-hmm.
really long,
Mm-hmm.
and very, very monotonous. It's just the nature of the sport. There's a lot that are daily routines, that there's not a ton of variation.
Right.
So what we try to do more than anything, from the physical development side of things, is to provide them that variation,
Mm-hmm.
because so much of their on-field work is very similar day to
Mm-hmm.
day. Then it's up to us to provide some of that variation so that they can get the deliberate practice necessary to improve their skills. And so that's more so how we can contribute currently to the fatigue management side. Like, it's certainly interesting, and there are some teams doing some on-field load monitoring with GPS technology or with accelerometry. It's certainly interesting,
Mm-hmm.
but that's our current approach, is to apply principles and make good decisions around those principles.
Gotcha. So, if you could talk for just a minute about, if there's some athletes that are listening right now, what are 3 or 4 things that they could do to decrease their risk of injury the most and increase their performance? I mean, what
Sure.
are,
Um, sleep,
yep,
sleep, and that's really complicated too, because
sure.
it's easy to say, like, oh, like, just sleep more, or spend more time in bed or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, like, there's there's a lot of, like, undiagnosed sleep issues.
Mm-hmm.
So if athletes are having difficulty sleeping,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and that's duration, quality, you name it, then just one thing I do is encourage them to seek the resources that are out there to help them with that. The other thing, obviously, is to have sound nutrition principles that you're following, and that can be really challenging for young athletes because there's not necessarily a tangible benefit that they see,
Right.
per se. I know, as an athlete, from my standpoint, it took me a really long time to really get some of those principles in place that worked for me. But again, like the good part about modern sport is there's a lot of resources. We're really fortunate to have, the best registered dietitian in baseball in Erica Sharp, and she's a great resource for our athletes. And I get a chance to work alongside her, which is great. But for those that are not necessarily in our arena of sport, there are plenty of really good resources out there to get better with nutrition, to help with sleep habits and sleep hygiene. But then, obviously the third thing, the strength coach in me is going to say, do some basic resistance training.
Right.
And I was very fortunate that, again, injuries are multifactorial, and maybe I had some other factors that let me be healthy as an athlete, but I didn't do a ton right in terms of improving myself in like the most evidence-based ways. I was the guy that wanted to take 5,000 swings every day and do that. But, one thing that I do believe contributed to me being a little bit more injury resistant than others was I did start resistance training pretty early on. I think I was like 12 or 13.
Oh, wow.
And I had a really good strength coach that was one of the best to this day that I've ever seen at coaching the basics. And for that, I think he just set me up for a longer career than it ever should have been. But I was really lucky to start resistance training early on.
And that was one thing I was talking with Dr. Soul about was that, following a very solid training program is not terribly exciting. It's one where you're sets of 10, sets of 5, sets of 3 in certain phases, and it's lots and lots of that done for years, But that's not what the athletes want to hear. But that's to my knowledge, what's going to be best is just, you don't need that huge variation, that huge range of exercises all the time. There's a handful that you need to get really good at and just get stronger.
And I was never, even though starting training at a pretty early age, I was never by any means the strongest guy on my team, not even really close. I was a pretty small kid. That continued up until even I was probably a junior in college before I really kind of grew up. So it wasn't even that I was this weight room hero either. But I had good technique with everything that I did because of the coaching that I received. And I followed really logical programming. The coach I worked under, his name's Darren Phelps. He's great. I'm still coaching back in my hometown. He learned under Al Vermeil, and really, a really good coach, and still is to this day. And I was so fortunate to find him early on, and I still keep in touch with him too. Like every time I'm in town, we'll try to, grab breakfast or stuff like that. Because he's probably one of the reasons I decided to go down this road, just because I had such a good experience in my adolescence with resistance training.
That's awesome. That's good to hear, because there's a ESPN put out a piece last week. I'm sure you saw it, where it was 2 words that every athlete should fear, or some bullshit like that, of strength coach. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe in the 1970s when it was just some guy who's screaming at everybody.
Yeah.
But in my mind, that's not effective coaching. Coaching should be one of those things where it's educational. You're teaching. It should be an environment where athletes want to spend time, where they want to come and train and learn and develop. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think the title of that piece was a little bit more excitable than maybe some of the content that they showed. I think a lot of things that you're speaking to, those coaches were demonstrating that. And they do have a pretty unique job that in terms of setting the culture for those powerhouse football organizations. And it's part of their role. And it's from the outside looking in. Like I do appreciate that the video, at least, it was trying to show that it was a pretty welcoming environment for most of what was displayed.
Right. Yeah, I like seeing at the end when it comes back and it says to a soft-spoken Cornhusker, Boyd Epler.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that was cool to see. But
Absolutely.
basic readiness, I guess, would be an interesting topic.
Sure.
Because we utilize more like RPE, rated perceived exertion training with our athletes,
Mm-hmm.
but we try to generally teach them about how percentages work. And just a simple thing that I talk to our athletes about is, percentages are great, but the thing I keep coming back to is they should be guidelines.
Yeah.
Within a training program. They're not forever and always written in stone because,
yeah,
in my opinion, if you're a really good tester, your numbers are going to be skewed, and if you're a really poor tester, your numbers are going to be skewed for the duration of that block. So, I'd just be interested to hear your views on basically in-season, off-season training. We have a lot of young athletes. We have very few. We have two guys that are in the MLB. We have one dude that's with Boston and one dude that's with Philadelphia. And I couldn't tell you which. They're not in the league, in the majors yet, but they're in that system. And one guy went to KU, basically started lifting at age 18, and he's still very, very young training age. Whereas the guy who's with Philly, it's like 25, 26, and he knows how to train. He went to Oregon, started lifting in high school, lifted in Oregon, and he has a pretty good idea of how to train. But I think since we have a lot of baseball guys that hopefully are going to listen to this thing, they would be interested to hear about, what do professionals, what does their training look like? And I know that can go a ton of different ways depending on the individual. But, anyway, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's mostly around kind of intensity prescription. And so from that standpoint, I've actually been really lucky to apply this method to a lot of different athletic populations. I used this when I was at DePaul, though I was learning the system at that time, so my application wasn't necessarily 100% right on. But with men's basketball athletes, I've used this, and then while at ETSU, working with the athletes there, worked with the volleyball program, worked with the baseball program, and also worked under Dr. Deweese with bobsled athletes, skeleton athletes, canoe kayak, those guys. And now that method is also used with our athletes with the Royals, and that's the set rep best method. It's created by Mike Stone. Okay. And then Dr. Deweese has made some like kind of his own modifications with repetitions in reserve. And that method for me is really useful to go back to your point on readiness. It kind of accounts for that. And there are relative and absolute percentages that are associated with the number of reps remaining for a given set and rep combination. But going the root of the program is using that subjective feel of how many more you have, and so that does account for some of that readiness. It allows you to train at with what you've got on that day, and it does allow you also to provide the variation needed in loading by doing some different things in that regard. And so the example application of something like this is you do have a number of reps left, spanning kind of very light up to very heavy. And it's for 3 sets of 10, for 3 sets of 5, for 3 sets of 3, kind of every set and rep combination that you use in your program. Right. You have this spectrum of repetitions in reserve, and a 3 sets of 3 heavy might be 1 to 2 left in the tank, and I'm going off the top of my head, so it might be not exactly that. Versus 3 sets of 10 heavy, you still might have 4 to 5 left in the tank, and so that there are differences between heavy and heavy for higher volumes and some of those lower volume, higher intensity athletes. But that system in general is really, really good. There is a learning curve to it, both from the coach side of it. Like I said, when I first adopted adopted that approach to loading. It took me some time to get a feel for it, and it does present some challenges for the athlete to know that too, because it's not necessarily training like how many do you have until failure.
Right.
It's more how many do you have left at that quality that would really matter. And so from that standpoint, like there are some kind of early stage bumps in the road. However, if you can stick with that system and use it pretty religiously, the learning curve tends to steepen or tends to even out, and it's a really good method for load prescription.
Okay. Yeah, that's.
No, go on.
Oh, I like that. Because that's one thing that's hard to get across to our athletes is talking to them about, is getting them to understand the big picture, and not that not every workout do they have to hit a PR, do they have to move on. We just gradually want that intensity to gradually creep up over time.
Right.
And I know the high school weight rooms that they're in, it might look cool to attempt 1RMs all the freaking time, but you're not gaining the amount of time under the bar that you need in order to continue to progress. So I really like that.
And it does conservatively prevent against training to failure, excuse me. Like even at the 3 sets of 2, there's typically very heavy. There's still like 0 to 1 left.
Right.
And so if a guy or girl is not able to say to you that they've got it, I could have maybe done one more. Like then okay, you've got to tone this down a little bit and make sure that the training environment is safe, and that will help obviously for the long-term changes that you see in training as well. And we use that in season. I know part of your question too is in season versus off season. Like we use that as our load prescription strategy all year round. We do have some other tools in place that support that method. Like we do have gym aware and those types of things that do allow for I'd say like a more sophisticated look at some of the methods that we're applying, but in large part, like we lean on the subjective interpretation of how many reps do they have left.
I gotcha. Now, another question I had is I think we talk with a lot of young athletes that are might make some assumptions about what professional athletes are doing and think that professionals are doing something, I don't know, more fancy and with all these cool gadgets and techniques. But I mean, is it really that, or are they continuing to hammer home the basics and just manipulate, intensity zones throughout the year?
I think the one thing that I find really rewarding about my current role is the diversity of the athletes that we get to work with. And with that, diversity also lends itself to a great deal of diversity in training age, training history. And we also have most of our athletes are very overskilled. Not overskilled because that's what got them where they are, but relative to their physical development, their skill levels are out of this world. And so even our most talented players, they might not have done much on the physical development side because they have dedicated a lot of their time to skill development. And so we get a lot of very low training age athletes. We're also international. So we get athletes from Latin American countries, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, those areas typically, but we do have athletes from other areas of the world too, in Europe and things like that. But those athletes are very young. And we have some American athletes that have not trained. We have some American athletes that are our college players or something like that have participated in a resistance training program for 10 years. that diversity gives us a pretty unique challenge to design programs at the group level.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have to make a lot of individualized considerations, but in large part, we do try to do basic things really well, and anchor our training in that. As players approach the major league and get closer there, and they do have years of training under their belt within our system, I will say that it does funnel down to something that's more individualized. Versus early on in their career, it is very general and group level. The way that I kind of try to conceptualize that early on the training is maybe more rooted in trying to drive up KPIs, so those key performance indicators, being strong, being powerful, running fast, all those things. But then as they get closer to the major league, more about removing barriers to performance. I call those potential restraint factors. And so like one way to look at that is that, if a guy, can't go deep into a game because of conditioning or because of strength levels or whatever, like that strength or that conditioning is actually like hindering his performance. And not necessarily that if we take his back squat from 200 to 400, he's going to start pitching better all of a sudden. But if we don't, it's potential to negatively influence what he's trying to do day in and day out. And so as they get closer to the major leagues, the program or the problem identification and performance solutions become very individualized. They become very nuanced because the margin of getting to the major league is raised within. And so that is a challenge that's associated with kind of their player development experience and process.
Okay. So how do you measure whether or not an athlete is strong or weak or powerful or not within your programming?
Yeah, so I mean, we have due to kind of the competitive nature of the arena that we're in, I can't share like that many details, but we have force platforms that we use a great deal for assessing some of those characteristics. And we do have a strength assessment. We have 2 strength assessments currently that we use as well. Some of those assessments are rooted in injury risk reduction. Some of them are rooted in performance. So we have kind of these 2 camps of assessing their physical capabilities, and our monitoring process in general is kind of equally rooted in both of those areas too. The fact of the matter is, because they are so skilled and because their skill is what's going to eventually get them to the major leagues, a great deal of importance needs to be on injury risk reduction. So if we can identify some red flags or things that are preventable or addressable, maybe is the better way to put that. Like they're modifiable risk factors. That's where we need to spend our time to keep that player on the field. Because getting a certain number of at bats, pitching a certain number of innings, like that's what's really going to be meaningful to allow them to progress through our system. So that does become, and it took me a while to kind of conceptualize that. Working with the Olympic hopeful side or working with men's basketball or some other population, it's very much about performance enhancement. But as the sport that I've been working with is really skewed towards skill dominant, it's been much more about keeping them on the field rather than enhancing performance per se.
Right, because there is a point of diminishing returns where, not that you can ever get like too strong, but at what point does it become, well, it's not going to get you any better at your sport if we move your squat up 10 pounds at the sacrifice of not being able to practice every day. So
and believe me, I come from the Dr. Mike Stone school of strength and do truly believe that strength is a vehicle. And I'm also from the school of Brad DeWeese, where his resistance training definitely underpins what he's trying to do from a speed development standpoint. So especially when we need players to run faster,
Mm.
It's definitely a program that is equal parts speed development tactics and resistance training tactics. Um, but some of the other aspects of baseball are much more complicated
Mm-hmm.
than simply uh, getting an athlete stronger.
Right.
And that's a really cool challenge, and one that we still try to get them stronger to
Mm.
help drive some other things. But it does become a pretty nuanced development process towards the end there.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what you mentioned a few minutes ago about individualization is some of our athletes will see what again they're 14, 15 years old, they see what the pro guys are doing, and they
Yep.
assume, oh well, I should do the same thing as these pro guys. It's like
Yeah.
you're not at the point yet where you need individualization. You need very
Right.
general movement patterns and play many sports, and then gradually we'll talk about how that needs to look as you get older.
Right. And I think some of it too is like identifying what those young athletes' goals are
Mm-hmm.
at their current stage of development. So one thing that I missed on as an athlete for a really long time, like I really wanted to get faster,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I didn't do anything to actually get faster until I was probably into my 20s. Uh, Before I realized, well, like if I want to get faster, what do 100-meter track and field athletes do for their training? Like,
Right.
what they're the people that try to run fast for a living.
Right.
Why am I not doing what they are doing? And that's when I did start kind of informally diving into Lauren Seagrave and Charlie Francis and all the people who were coaching these all the people that were coaching these elite 100-meter runners. It was kind of my aha moment. And so I think a lot of times, we, even in identifying what players want to work on at this level, is say, well, what do you want to accomplish this off season?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you want to get faster? That's great. There's a ton of methods
Right.
from the track and field community that can help us in getting you faster. And so, like, their training because of that looks a lot like a track athlete.
Right.
And so, especially for the younger athletes, it is going to be more about uh, moving the needle on general physical qualities
Mm-hmm.
instead of something very specific to their sport, just because they need these physical prerequisites in order to get to those really advanced skills. And they're going to be more likely to self-select good motor control strategies if they've got some of these prerequisites in place. And so the younger athletes definitely do need to kind of take a step back at what it means to be
Mm-hmm.
a better baseball, basketball, football player at this point in their career. Like, what is preventing them from developing better skills or getting more playing time or whatever the case may be, because a lot of times it is something that's really simple,
Mm-hmm.
really simple. So that's kind of the step back I would encourage for the younger kids.
So, what would an example be? Like, say you have two athletes, and um, one has a training age of 2 years, and one has a training age of 10 years. So,
Mhm.
what are some basic power methods you'd use for basic versus advanced? Like, how do those look different?
Yeah. So the more beginner athlete, um, can do simpler things, for lack of a better term. There, we would tend to use more rudimentary plyometrics.
Mm-hmm.
Tend to use variation in loading. That's a very underestimated and underappreciated way to make people more powerful. That can come in heavy and light days. So if you've got a 2 day a week resistance training program, the first day is heavier, the second day is lighter, so that you can weight faster.
Right.
There's also downsets, and downsets you can get pretty creative with. So if I do my 3 sets of 5 back squat for my work sets and resistance training,
Mm-hmm.
I'll do an additional set at a lighter weight, at a reduced load, and really prioritize moving that weight fast. You can also introduce plyometrics during down sets or loaded jumps, or something that is basic but looks like the resistance training movement that you just completed. So there are some of those kind of general methodologies for the beginners, whereas the more advanced athlete, like that's where they are going to need to have higher and more varied mechanical demands on their power development. Those are the types of folks that tend to do more repeat plyometrics, tend to do accentuated eccentric loaded plyometrics, where there's a really high eccentric rate of force development to deal with in kind of both of those methods. Because what you're presuming with that advanced training age is that they have the strength to tolerate and return that stored eccentric energy, versus the beginner, you would presume that they probably don't. And so that's really what you're balancing out, is the ability to tolerate and transmit eccentric forces, and provide more variation at the back end. So the more advanced athletes, they need more variation in their training. The lesser athletes, from a training age standpoint, they don't require as much variation. And so, like, in power development methods, they also need to be representative of that. And so you might have more methods in place. You might have downsets, potentiation complexes, all of that stuff at AEL, all in place for the advanced athlete. You might have downsets for the novice athlete, or you might have heavy and light days. That's it. So it's kind of even the programming exists on a spectrum, just in the way that the training age exists on a spectrum.
And that's a really great sentence you just said about tolerating and transmitting. I think that's something I'm going to steal from you. And
I probably stole it from somebody else too. So no, don't worry. I wouldn't feel too bad about that one.
But in terms of percentages, when you're using AEL, what's the highest you guys have utilized with that? Like 120%, 150%?
When I first got the weight releasers, I did some more adventurous things. Myself and Dr. Stone were in the weight room for about 2 hours one Saturday, and just continuing to load it up and load it up and load it up. And I don't know where we got to from a percentage standpoint, but it was probably in the neighborhood of 150, 160%.
Cool.
On the weight releasers. And the concentric load, we kept it something I knew I could do, but it was pretty heavy. But we were actually just trying to see when technique really broke down.
Right.
We took the very informal approach of kind of adding a 20 kilo plate onto the weight releaser every set, and figuring out where that started to happen, because we were at the time actually trying to determine where the loading needed to be from the dissertation.
Yep.
And we both felt pretty strongly that the technical aspect was important.
Right.
And so we needed to see kind of where that breaking point was. And we got pretty high up there. From a programming standpoint, we've tended to stay more in the 105 to 120 when we are using super maximal loads on the eccentric phase, and that's generally where the literature would sit to. And then with the concentric phase associated with that, we try to have at least a 30% gap in between whatever is the overload and what's happening in the concentric phase.
Gotcha. So were you wrecked for 3-4 days after that? Was it longer?
Yeah, it was a tough stretch there. I was just glad I made it out of the session without being too banged up. But I had a good spotter, so I was okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it definitely was a tough session that lingered with me for a couple days.
That's awesome, man. The only other question I had is, where can people find you on social media? And then ResearchGate, do you have any research topics you're working on right now?
Yeah. So I'm probably most accessible. I'm still trying to get into the Instagram thing. But for kind of professional stuff, I tend to use Twitter. and I'm at Dr. John P. Wagle
Yep.
on there and Instagram, but I'm much easier to reach on Twitter. On ResearchGate, I do have a ResearchGate page if you guys want to check anything out. I'm still currently conducting research on AEL, partnering with Dr. Tabor and some others on that. I'm in some validation studies currently, and we're also looking to explore partnering with Dr. Kevin Carroll and some others. We're going to look into some of our athlete monitoring data from some athletes we worked with in the past that we have a pretty deep data set on, from training loads and wellness questionnaires and jump data and things like that. So we're going to start to kind of deconstruct what it means to go through a competitive season with some different athletic populations. And so we're really excited to get some of that off the ground too.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much for being on and taking the time to sit down with us today.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much.